Which console is the best to play PlayStation 1 games? Is it the PlayStation 1, the PlayStation 2, or the PlayStation 3? It's the PlayStation 1. Thanks for watching. But let's get into some more detail, and the truth of the matter is that it's simply better. Hello, and today I wanted to do a slightly different video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the three main consoles that will be compatible with the PlayStation 1. The PlayStation 1, PS2 and PS3. Sony's been offering backwards compatibility since the PlayStation 2, and the PS3 also supports it somewhat. But which one is the better PlayStation? So I've got them all laid out here. They're not exactly the same model for each console, obviously, not the same generation. Well, this is actually the later slim model PS1, or PS1 as people like to call it, or as PSONE, or ONI, or ONE, or Oni-chan, or they will spell the one with a capital O even though it's a lowercase. This is actually the most reliable version of the PlayStation 1 ever released, and it's also the only one because the older models were called the PSX. So I decided to give you my own opinion on the matter and once and for all decide which one is the best way to experience PlayStation 1 games. Remember, this is my own opinion, so it is basically objectively true. I've been playing PlayStation 1 games ever since this bad boy came out, and this is actually my own childhood PlayStation, and I cherish it very much, and I still use it fairly frequently. But I have many other models of this, so this is not necessarily the one I usually go for. And this one is basically perfect. You wouldn't believe it. This console has 100% compatibility with PlayStation 1 games. You just open the lid, put the game in, and then it plays it. It's wonderful. This is the original intended experience. You can use cables like RGB SCART and S-video cables, and what you really should not be using is your composite cable. Please, people, get some better cables, for God's sakes. Just because you have a $400 scaler doesn't mean that composite cable is simply gonna just deliver a decent quality image. A lot of people are under the impression that the PlayStation 2 here is actually the best way to play PS1 games. So what's behind this sleek and sexy looking console with the sexy looking ridges that are really difficult to clean the dust out of? Well, we have the original ports for starters, which is pretty cool, so you could just basically plug in your PlayStation 1 controllers and memory cards in there and they will work, but only for PlayStation 1 games for the most part. What makes this console great for backwards compatibility is the fact that these models actually carry the original PlayStation 1 CPU on board as a I/O processor for the console. And when it switches into PS1 mode, it just basically clocks it down to the right frequency for the console and is capable of playing back PS1 games almost perfectly, but not quite. So this machine sounds great. Chuck out your old PlayStation 1 and just keep your PS2 and then play your PS1 games on that. But, you probably shouldn't. While you do get an extra video option in the name of component video, this is actually not 100% backwards compatible with PS1 games. In fact, there are also some websites talking about the certain games of the PS1 library that do not work properly on PlayStation 2. And that is not only true for this model, the first fat model, but also the later models might even have worse compatibility due to the lack of the PlayStation 1 CPU on board. Starting with SCPA 75000, also known as the Deckard consoles, Sony decided to remove the PS1 I/O chip, and in place of it we get the so-called Deckard chip, which is a PowerPC CPU taking the responsibility of PS1 playback and also the I/O processing. This chip is very interesting because that means that every slim console starting with the 75000 is basically capable of playing PS1 games at a better frame rate potentially, but not all the time. There are some instances where it's actually faster to play on the original hardware. So SCPH 10,000 up until 70,000 are the consoles that have the PS1 CPU on board, and then 75,000 to 90,000 are the ones that don't. Probably the best example that comes to mind is my favorite PlayStation game, Mizurna Falls. Check it out, by the way, really cool game. This one runs so much better on Deckard consoles. We actually use it for speedruns. The original hardware runs it way slower. Another example I can think of where the PS2 Deckard actually runs PS1 games slower than the original or the fat models is actually, for example, Silent Hill tends to sometimes run a little bit better, weirdly enough, but then other times it's incredibly choppy on Deckard consoles, so yeah, it is weird. One misconception about the PS2 is that it's fully compatible with PS1 games. Not really. Actually, the graphics are emulated. So while it does have, the earlier models do have the original PS1 CPU on board, the graphics were always emulated, and these can cause graphical issues in many video games. For example, Silent Hill. In the video description, I'll link a web page where you can check out some games that have problems playing back on the PS2. Now, some of the improvements that Sony brought to the table, if you can call them improvements, one of them is texture smoothing, and it's absolutely hideous. It looks horrible. I don't know why anyone would even consider it an improvement. And the other one is fast disk speed. Now, this is an interesting one. In some games, it actually works pretty well. Other games are completely broken with it. What happens is the original PlayStation 1's playback speed is 1x to 2x, so it's got two speeds. Sometimes it switches between 1 and 2. You can even hear the difference in the noise level. Now the PS2 will do the same thing, play at 1x and 2x, but in fast disk speed mode it will change it to 2x and 4x. So it will switch between these two. This can actually break compatibility with those games that have XA or CD audio and those music or cutscene audio or whatever may play faster than intended. Also, one thing that a lot of people have run into in the past is trying to use the PS2 by a component cable and hooking it up to a television that has component inputs and not being able to see the game. That usually happens because the TV may not support the 240p resolution of PS1 games via component cables, and it might work through SCART, but then it might be misinterpreting it as 480i and whatnot. It's a whole rabbit hole, I'm not going to bore you with that, but basically most PS1 games will run in 240p mode, and some TVs may not support that through component video. But if you're using your PS2 through an upscaler like you should, then it should be fine. You get, I guess, more room on your desk if that's a problem, so you don't have to have a PS1 and a PS2, although look how tiny it is. I mean, this is so much smaller than the PS2, but anyways, I guess there's that. But also, there's a problem with the disk drive in PS2s. I mean, this is the only model that's actually reliable, like the only PlayStation 2 that's worth buying, the 30,000 model. Starting with the 39,000, especially the 50,000 and the 70,000, you can run into a problem where basically your laser itself will destroy your disk as it's trying to read it. To demonstrate what happens with a 50K console, let's say this is a disk and my hand is the laser. If the laser can't see the disk properly, it will just try to adjust itself, push more voltage into the laser, and also extract it even higher, because the laser actually likes to move up and down to try and focus in on the disk. So this is what happens if it can't read the CD. So tries to look for it, can't find it, and then starts punching your CD to the point your CD might be completely destroyed by the 50,000 consoles. So whenever you read online that the 50,000 is the most reliable PS2, it's fucking bullshit, and they need to shut the fuck up, or just, I don't know. The 30,000 will never do that. Also, some consoles have another problem reading PS1 CDs as well, especially if you have like expensive discs, but not just PS1 discs, actually it's like all kinds of discs. Let's just say I wouldn't put any expensive discs into a slim PS2 because of the impending doom of the ribbon cable that is held down by an adhesive, and if it loosens up, it can damage your $300 copy of Silent Hill, whatever. So there you go. Great console, the PS2. Some people's favorite. Anyways, yeah, I would rate it, the fat models, I would rate it maybe like a 6 out of 10. Slim models, I would rate it, I mean, if it's well maintained, like if you've replaced the ribbon cable recently, I would rate it maybe a 5 out of 10. There's actually some cool stuff about the Deckard consoles. There's a program being developed for it called DKW Drive, which is going to be a PlayStation 1 driver replacement for the PS2, but it currently only works on Deckard consoles when you want to load games off USB, and that's actually the most interesting feature. It's still in beta, it's still very buggy. I'm still waiting for a new update to actually properly talk about it, because it's very exciting. Hopefully one day we'll be able to play PS1 games off a USB thumb drive on the Deckard console perfectly. Now let's talk about this bad boy. Oh, jeez. So, you might be wondering why it's so dusty. Well, I just wanted to make a point that I never use this thing for playing PS1 games because they're f***ing trash. I mean, first of all, look at this behemoth. This thing weighs, I think, 7 kilograms or something. It's ridiculous. I've actually once had it put on top of a PS2, and poor PS2 was making so many crackling noises. I was afraid for its life. This fat boy is the PlayStation 3, and no, none of them are hardware compatible with the PS1. Every single PS3 ever has always been software emulation. So those people who love to waste their money trying to find a backwards compatible PlayStation 3 that has the PS2 hardware in it, they will not be able to get anywhere closer to playing back PS1 games properly on this console. Let's mention some cool things about it. It looks really, really good. The scaling, if you have the console set to 720p and you're playing an NTSC game on it, looks fantastic. Very sharp, very nice 3x upscale from 240p to 720p on the PS3. That looks incredibly good. So it's actually a very cheap option for that, if you want to do that. The thing about this, though, is that the PlayStation 3 has 2 separate emulators. So you might want to use custom firmware and use the better one. Because if you're downloading a game off PSN, you'll actually get a slightly worse emulator, in my opinion, because the sharpness of the image is much worse. Whereas if you shove a CD into the disgusting Blu-ray drive of this console, then it's actually going to be giving you a better image. You won't be needing to use a scaler for this. You can just set it up to 720p and it will give you a beautiful image. Whereas with the other consoles, you might want to use some kind of scaler to get the proper image quality out of it and proper handling of 240p. Using custom firmware actually turns it into a really cool idea on paper, where you can just fill up your hard drive with PS1 games, and that sounds cool. Like, it's very convenient. Convenience-wise, I would feel like it's probably the best. However, you don't get that mechanical feeling of putting the disc into the console, and the amazing PlayStation 1 boot chime, by the way. I forgot to mention that because it's so natural to me. So, yeah, it has its ups and downs, but there's probably more downs than ups. Weirdly enough, performance-wise, the emulator on this console is actually very similar to the Deckard PS2 consoles. If I compared Miserna Falls running on a Deckard PS2 and the PlayStation 3, playback speed is actually roughly identical, which is very interesting. What's even more interesting is DuckStation seems to have about the same speed as well. I don't know where they got that from. Caveat, this console doesn't have fast disk speed, so it's going to be not only as slow as the PlayStation 1, but maybe even a little bit slower. I'm not quite sure on that. It's definitely not very fast. Now, another thing is that emulation is not perfect. It's actually worse than what you get on the PS2. There might be some weird audio issues here and there. I've noticed a couple things, like some games may be lacking a low-pass filter, where you would hear that on the original console, so things might sound really harsh. Some of the sound effects don't sound quite right. There could be visual glitches as well in many games. So it really is just a meh emulator. It, does the job, but really not the best way to play PlayStation 1 games. It is significantly worse than PS2 or PS1. Not to mention, it's one of the most inefficient ways of playing PlayStation games. I mean, not only is it not capable of playing them properly a lot of the times, but also, especially this fat model is consuming so much power. The PS1, it comes with a 7.5 volt power adapter at 2 amps. You know how much it uses? Probably like 1 amp or something. It uses like 7.5 watts, give or take. PlayStation 2, 50 watts. Does it say on the back how much this thing is using? Oh, 1.7 amps. So that's what? I mean, the power supply, that means it's around 400 watt power supply. I think it's actually like 380 watts, the power supply in this thing, in this specific model, or maybe the earlier ones. But I've used a power consumption meter before, and I think it uses around, playing back PS1 games, I think like 120 watts or something like that. Which is ridiculous! 120 watts! Playing this thing for 1 hour will use about as much power as playing this for 3 hours. Or this one all day, I don't know. I mean, of course, there are like lower consumption console variants as well, like the slim models may use less power. I don't have that. I don't have the super slim. Those look kind of cool, but yeah, those you can't install CFW on it. So you can only install CFW on the crappy PlayStation 3s that have hardware issues or use too much power. And then The newer ones can only have a hen, but I mean, I don't know about chickens. There's also another alternative that I don't have, which is if you have a PSP Go and you put an enormous memory card in it, you can just shove it full of PS1 games, hook it up to the TV, connect it to like some kind of DualShock 4 or 3 or whatever, and then play your PS1 games on that. That's actually kind of cool. It uses less power than this beast, and I think the emulation may be slightly better as well. But still, I don't know. There's just something about this thing. It's so much better than the other options. I mean, overall, PS2 is okay but not great. PS3 is very meh. PS1 is still the king when it comes to playing back PS1 games. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.